Midnight struck. The sound was not merely a chime, it was a heavy, metallic vibration that traveled through the floorboards and settled deep into the marrow of my bones. I stood in the center of the foyer, the air stagnant and thick with the smell of trapped dust and decades of decay. My flashlight beam cut a sharp, singular path through the gloom, illuminating swirling motes of debris that danced in the light like tiny, suspended insects. I had come alone to settle the estate, expecting nothing more than a quiet inventory of wood and stone. Yet, the house felt crowded. Every corner held a shadow that seemed to retreat just as my light touched it. I took a step forward, the movement deliberate, testing the integrity of the floor. The wood groaned under my boots, a low, Protestant sound that echoed too long in the hollow space. I stopped, letting the silence return, but it was not empty. It was a heavy, expectant silence. I adjusted my grip on the flashlight, the metal casing cold and slick. I was an intruder in a place that had never truly been abandoned. I turned my back on the foyer and moved toward the staircase. The wood groaned under my boots, a sharp, rhythmic protest that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. I took another step, and the sound stretched, warping into a sibilant, elongated whisper. It was not the house settling, it was my name. The sound curled around the banister and hung in the air, a breathy, distorted imitation of my own voice. I froze, my breath hitched in the stagnant air, and I held the flashlight steady, though my hand began to tremble. I waited for the sound to repeat, straining to hear anything beneath the creaking timber. The silence returned, but it was different now. It felt intentional. I looked up at the dark, yawning throat of the staircase, where the shadows seemed to thicken and coil like living things. I took a tentative step backward, my heel catching on the edge of a rug, and the house groaned again, a low, guttural vibration that rippled through the floorboards. It was no longer just a structure of wood and nails. It was watching. I pressed my back against the wall, the plaster cold and gritty against my skin. I pushed away from the wall and moved into the parlor, the beam of my light sweeping across the room until it caught the silvered surface of a tall, antique mirror. It dominated the far wall, framed in dark, ornate wood that seemed to absorb the light. I raised the flashlight, intending to check the room for exits, but my own image stopped me cold. I stood in the center of the frame, but my reflection was not looking back at me. It was turned away, staring intently toward the corner of the room, its posture rigid and alert. I blinked, convinced the glass was warped or the light was playing tricks on my eyes. I stepped forward, bringing the light closer to the surface, and pressed my palm against the cool, smooth glass. The reflection did not move. It remained fixed, its head angled toward the shadows I could not see. Then, slowly, the reflection began to tilt its head. It was a mechanical, jerky motion that defied the fluidity of my own movement. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs as the lips in the glass began to curve. It was a jagged, unnatural expression, stretching wider than any human jaw should allow, revealing too many teeth in the dim light. The smile widened, a silent, predatory gesture that mirrored nothing in the room behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting a wild, frantic arc through the parlor. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but the room was empty. The furniture sat in its usual dust-covered positions, and the shadows remained still. I swung the light into the corners, searching for the source of that impossible smile, but there was nothing. Only the stale, heavy scent of trapped air and decay. I took a step toward the doorway, my boots silent on the floorboards. The silence was absolute. It was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical weight pressing against my eardrums until they throbbed. I stopped, holding my breath, and listened. The house had ceased its groaning. Even the wind outside seemed to have vanished, leaving me in a vacuum. I felt a prickle of static electricity crawl up the back of my neck. The air in the room grew suddenly, unnaturally cold, turning my breath into a faint, swirling mist. I turned slowly, scanning the space behind me, but the parlor remained undisturbed. Yet, the sensation of being watched intensified, shifting from a prickle to a heavy, suffocating pressure. I was not alone. Something was standing mere inches away, invisible and waiting. I gripped the flashlight until my knuckles turned white, my eyes darting across the darkness. The strike came without warning. A sudden, sharp pressure tightened around my throat, cutting off my breath in a single, brutal motion. Cold, Thin fingers dug into my skin, their grip unyielding and impossibly strong. I gasped, but the sound died in my chest as the pressure intensified. I was lifted inches off the floor, my legs dangling in the empty air, kicking uselessly against the void. I clawed at my neck, my fingernails scraping against something that felt like ice-cold hardened muscle. But I could not break the hold. My flashlight slipped from my grip, clattering across the floorboards as I was hauled backward. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut with a force that rattled the window panes in their frames, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. The heavy thud of the lock engaging signaled the end of any hope of escape. I reached out, my hands flailing in the dark, desperate to find a wall. Every light in the house flickered once and then vanished entirely, plunging the hallway into absolute, suffocating blackness. The darkness was not empty. It was thick, pressing against my eyes like a physical weight. My lungs burned, screaming for air that refused to enter. I tried to thrash, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if I were sinking into deep water. Then, the silence broke. It did not come from the hallway or the walls. It resonated deep within my own skull, vibrating against my teeth with a sickening, familiar frequency. It was my own voice. Distorted, hollow, and stripped of all warmth, it whispered directly into my consciousness. "You never left. You left." I tried to scream, to force a sound out of my throat to drown out the intrusion, but my vocal cords remained locked. The grip on my neck did not falter. It only tightened, a cold, relentless pressure that seemed to feed on my panic. The voice spoke again, layered and overlapping, as if multiple versions of me were speaking in unison. The paradox clawed at my mind. I reached out, my hand brushing against the wall, but the surface was no longer wood. It felt wet, yielding, and impossibly cold, like skin stretched over stone. I was no longer a visitor in this house. The boundaries of my own identity were dissolving, bleeding into the foundation. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer blow, the voice claiming my space. I clawed at the air, my fingers searching for a release that did not exist. My vision swam in shades of gray, the edges of my sight fraying as the oxygen vanished. I looked down, desperate for a point of reference, and saw the floorboards beneath me. My own shadow lay stretched across the wood, but it was not mimicking my posture. It was detached. While I hung suspended, my shadow reached upward, its elongated, ink-black fingers wrapping tight around my throat. The realization hit harder than the physical pain. It was not a ghost or a stranger. It was my own silhouette, a manifestation of my presence in this place, turning against me. I kicked out with everything I had, my heel striking something solid and cold, but the grip remained, anchored by the very floor I stood upon. The house was not a structure of wood and stone. It was a loop of time, a closed circuit where I was both the victim and the source of the violence. I felt the floorboards beneath me pulse, a rhythmic thrumming that matched the beat of my own failing heart. I was no longer a visitor stepping through these rooms. I was becoming part of the foundation, a permanent fixture in a cycle that had no beginning and no end. The shadow tightened its hold, and as my consciousness began to fracture, I understood that I was never going to walk out of this house. The air in the room grew thin, tasting of dust and ancient decay. I slumped against the wall, my strength bleeding away into the floorboards. The shadow's grip did not loosen. It held me in place, a silent anchor in the dark. Then, the voice returned, closer this time, vibrating directly against my ear. It was cold, precise, and entirely my own. "The door is locked from the inside," it whispered, the words echoing through the hollow space of my chest. I tried to push away, to find a handle or a latch, but my hands only met the unyielding surface of the wall. The voice continued, a cruel cadence that stripped away my final hopes. "You have always been the one holding the key." The realization settled in, heavier than the darkness itself. There was no intruder to fight, no exit to find. Every motion I had made, every step I had taken since entering the house, had only served to bolt the door tighter. I stopped struggling. I was the lock. I was the key. I was the architecture of my own imprisonment. The house breathed around me, and I finally stopped fighting the dark. The darkness was no longer an external force. It was the air I breathed. I leaned back, and the wall behind me did not feel like plaster or timber. It felt like skin. My spine pressed into the grain of the house, and I felt the wood shift, molding itself to the shape of my back. The rhythmic thrumming grew louder, a deep, tectonic vibration that rattled my teeth and settled into my marrow. My pulse was no longer my own. It was the house. Every beat was a creak in the floorboards, a settling of rafters, a slow, inevitable expansion of the foundation. I tried to lift my hand, but my fingers were heavy, rooted into the surface beneath me. I was not dying. I was being absorbed. The boundaries between my skin and the house blurred. I felt the cold dampness of the earth beneath the floorboards rising through my feet, anchoring me to the soil. My vision, already dim, flickered one last time, matching the dying light of the hallway. The voice in my head faded into a low, ambient hum. I was the house. I was the draft in the hallway. I was the groan of the stairs under the weight of a memory. The final beat of my heart resonated through the walls, a soft, metallic chime that echoed into the silence. Then, there was only the house, breathing in the dark, waiting for the next visitor to turn the key. I was no longer a visitor. I was the foundation. I was the lock. I was the house. And I was finally, permanently, home.